Tonight, you walk past a cemetery without thinking twice. Maybe you glance at a stone, maybe you don't. You've grown up with the idea that death is marked, mourned, and remembered, and that feels uniquely human. It feels like the thing that separates us from every other creature on this planet. But there is an animal living right now on the African savanna that stands over its dead in silence, touches the bones with its feet, and refuses to leave. And nobody, not one scientist alive today, can fully explain why. The answer changes everything we think we know about grief, consciousness, and where the boundary between human and animal actually sits. Most people assume mourning is a cultural invention, something we learned or were taught. But that's not quite right. And the real answer is far stranger than anything a textbook has ever offered you. In 1975, a researcher named Cynthia Moss was working with the Amboseli Elephant Research Project in Kenya. She had been watching the same family of elephants for years, tracking them across the dry lakebed at the foot of Kilimanjaro. One afternoon, a matriarch named Tina collapsed and died. What happened in the hours that followed changed the course of animal behavior research. The other elephants did not scatter. They gathered. They used their trunks to lift her head. They tried, repeatedly, to get her upright. When she would not rise, they stood around her body in what Moss described as complete stillness. Then, one by one, they each touched her with their feet and the tips of their trunks. The youngest members of the herd, calves who had never experienced death, did exactly what the adults did. Nobody taught them. And Moss, standing at a distance with a notebook, had no framework to explain what she was seeing. The central question she carried out of that field that evening was one that would take decades to even begin answering. Are elephants grieving? Or are they doing something else entirely? But here's what's fascinating. Subsequent research at Amboseli showed this was not a one-off event. By 2005, Karen McComb at the University of Sussex had collected enough data to conduct a controlled study. She and her team presented wild elephants with 3 objects: an ivory tusk, a piece of wood, and a skull from a deceased elephant. The living elephants showed no particular interest in the wood, some interest in the ivory. But when they encountered the skull, their behavior changed completely. They spent significantly more time touching it, investigating it, returning to it. McComb recorded that elephants showed a specific preference for skulls and ivory from their own species over any other material. The study, published in Biology Letters, noted that elephants even showed heightened responses to skulls belonging to their own family members, suggesting some form of individual recognition that persists beyond death. And honestly, what comes next is even stranger. Elephants don't just visit the dead once, they return. Ian Douglas Hamilton, founder of Save the Elephants, documented multiple cases through the 1980s and 1990s of elephant families revisiting the same carcass site across months and even years. In one documented case from Samburu National Reserve in northern Kenya, a family returned to the same location 17 times over a period of 14 months. They were not searching for water. They were not confused. The site had nothing left to offer them except memory, or something that functioned like it. This is the moment everything began to come apart for the standard scientific model of animal cognition. Because the prevailing assumption, built from decades of behaviorist thinking, was that animals process death as absence. Absence of stimulus, absence of movement, and they move on. But elephants do not move on. They seek out the remains. They carry fragments of bone for miles before setting them down. Researchers observing elephants in Hwange National Park in Zimbabwe in 2016 recorded an elephant carrying a femur for over 3 kilometers with no apparent functional reason. But that's only half the story. When an elephant dies from natural causes in the presence of its herd, the physical responses of the other animals include temporal gland secretion, which is associated with heightened emotional states, decreased feeding, increased vocalizations in the infrasonic range below human hearing, and a measurable increase in cortisol detectable in dung samples collected within 24 hours. These are not random behaviors. These are physiological grief markers. The same hormonal signature that your brain produces at a funeral. Here's the part nobody talks about. The popular framing of elephant grief almost always stops at behavior. We see the images, we watch the documentaries, and we conclude that elephants are mourning in the way humans do. But that interpretation actually obscures something more profound and more uncomfortable. The real gap in the science is not whether elephants experience something like grief. Most researchers now accept that they do. The real gap is that we have no model for what it means to grieve without language, without ritual codified through culture, without any of the structures we've always assumed grief requires. Elephants have no priests, no funerary rites passed down through text, no shared theology about what death means, and yet the behavior is there, consistent across populations in Kenya, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Myanmar. Which means grief might not be a product of consciousness in the way we've always defined it. It might be older than consciousness itself. A 2016 paper published in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B, authored by Frans de Waal at Emory University, argued that emotional homology, the idea that emotions evolved from common ancestral structures, means the neurological architecture for grief likely predates the split between human and elephant lineages by tens of millions of years. You are not mourning because you were taught to. Your brain is mourning because it was built for it, long before your species existed. And the elephant standing over its dead is doing the same thing, with the same ancient machinery, in the same ancient silence. That should unsettle you, because we tend to think of grief as the cost of love, and love as something that emerged with intelligence, culture, language, art. But if an elephant in Amboseli is processing loss with no language and no culture, then we have to reconsider what love actually is and where it came from. A 2021 survey by the Pew Research Center found that 68% of Americans consider the capacity to grieve one of the defining features of human uniqueness. Elephants suggest that number is built on a category error. Your grief and theirs share a root. That root is not in your civilization. It is in your cells. What if grief was never about death at all? What if it was always about attachment? About the brain marking what it cannot afford to lose before it loses it? Every culture, every generation, every species that forms lasting bonds eventually develops some version of this. The elephant at Amboseli stands over Tina in 1975. You walk past a cemetery without thinking. Both of you are carrying something old, something that was there before the stone, before the name, before the word. We are not alone in this.